Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to try a slightly different video. I figured I talked about how I like doing projects to build things and then taking those things places and trying to explore some new areas for me. So I figured I'd do a video today on some basics for photography. I know that with modern cameras like the iPhones and the Droids, you can get a pretty good picture with just regular automatic settings. If you do have a DSLR or a mirrorless, you can get really good shots with the basic settings on those as well. But just wanted to give you a really quick run through on how to use manual mode on a Canon DSLR. So let me turn you around here and we'll take a look at the one I've got, and I'll show you some of the settings and some of what you can find on the lenses and things you might want to know. So here we go. So the first thing I want to show you is the kind of information you can get from one of these lenses. So this is a fixed lens. It's a 50 millimeter. So if we take a look over here, we can see the type of lens we're dealing with. Designed for a 35 millimeter camera. Sorry about that. That's a 0.35 meter or 1.1 foot to infinity. So that's your focus, what kind of focus it can do. So that tells you that this lens will take you down to a little over 1 foot away and still be in focus. So this is a pretty broad lens as far as the zoom is concerned. That can be pretty useful to you. On the front here, let's see if we can get this to where you can see it. So you got a couple pieces of information on here. Up top here, this number right next to my finger, that's the size of the threads on the end of this lens. So if you were going to get a thread-on filter or some kind of a thread-on lens hood, you would use that 49 millimeter size to tell you what to work with on this one. Down here, if we turn this over, this is information about the f-stop that your lens is capable of. So this one is 1 to 1.8. So basically what that means is this one can get pretty wide open and pretty small altogether. This is a nice broad functioning lens. The deal is that will change depending on what you're working with. So let me show you what we've got here. Okay. So this one is a zoom lens. I think you can see that there. So this one is a 75 to 300 millimeter zoom lens. And over here to the right, you can see you have a 1 to 4 to 5.6. So what that means is when this lens is at its 75 millimeter setting, as it is here, you can use an f-stop down to 4. When you're fully zoomed out, zoomed in, fully zoomed into 300 millimeter, you can use an f-stop down to 5.6. Anything past that, the lens won't be able to do anyway. So you do have to keep that in mind when you're setting up your camera. Down here, we have our millimeters. So if you want to get a specific setting on the lens, you can adjust this a little bit accordingly. And a lot of these lenses, let me see if this one has it on here. This one does not, but a lot of these lenses do have a focus ring, which is here, but then they have a diagram, usually on the barrel of the lens somewhere, that allows you to help with your focus as far as distance from you to the object. If you happen to know what that is, you can set the focus ring and it should be pretty close. Now, I don't normally use that. The autofocus on these cameras is really good. So as long as you use the right, when you look at the right thing through your viewfinder, You'll have a little box or a series of boxes. As long as you get those on the points you want in focus, you should do fine. Okay, so camera settings. I'm going to turn this on here. Okay, so I'm in manual mode. You can see over here you've got the M pointed at your little dot here. So your automatic mode for this particular camera, usually it's green, and in this case it would be this one down here. That's your auto mode. There, see if I can turn it for you. So in that case, the camera has full control over your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Now that's nice if you really need to take a quick shot. You don't have time to set your settings, maybe you don't have a lot of experience with those settings. The automatic feature is really nice. However, there are things that it doesn't do well. So you may choose to adjust something to help you get a certain kind of shot. So for instance, what I just did, I just changed this to TV. Now this is true for all Canons. I honestly don't know what the Nikons use, but TV is a shutter speed priority setting. So when you look over here on the top of your not your viewfinder, when you look at your display over here, you can see I'm set at 1/250th of a second. So as I adjust this top dial here, you can see how it's changing that number. So as I turn this to the right, I'm increasing my shutter speed to a faster speed. So in this setting, I'm sitting at 1/2000th of a second. Now this becomes important when you're dealing with moving targets, or if you're in a situation where you're going to freehand the camera, so you're not shooting from a tripod. So if you're going to freehand the camera and you're taking pictures of still still subjects, then you're going to want to use nothing slower than 1/60th of a second. If you go slower than that, you really do need to be supporting the camera on something. Now that might be a tripod, that might be just kneeling down and putting it on your lap, or holding it in front of you, bracing your elbows against something, or maybe using a monopod. But definitely keep it faster than 1/60th of a second if you're going to freehand the camera. Okay? If you're talking about shooting moving subjects, then you're trying to decide from there, how fast does it need to be in order to stop motion? So in general, if you're dealing with a person that might just be walking around or not doing a very quick movement, about 1/125th to 1/60th of a second should be plenty to stop that motion. If you're taking pictures of something that's moving a little faster, like a bird in flight, or let's say you've got an animal that's running crossways to you, or if you're dealing with, say, taking pictures of sports, individuals in the middle of throwing, catching, using racket sports, things like that, I would step this up to about 1/250th of a second. You might even need to go a little bit faster than that. The trick is your exposure, your overall picture is going to be determined by how much light do you put on the sensor for how long. So in this setting, what we're going to do, this camera is set up in such a way that I pick the shutter speed, and then it's going to pick the aperture, so the size of hole the light goes through, and the ISO. Now let me change my ISO here, because you can adjust that separately on these cameras. There, now we're set to auto. So now the camera has full control of everything except the shutter speed. So I would use this setting specifically when I know that I need a particular shutter speed to freeze motion or to freehand the camera, and I don't want to even think about the rest of the settings. This gives me that ability to make that choice. Okay, then the overall aperture choice and ISO will give you the ability to get a good exposure on your shot while you're picking shutter speed. So over here, if I then change this from the TV to the AV, so you see where we are now. Now when you look at this over here, instead of having a shutter speed, which was up here in this section, which is now blank, I now have this number over here. This is my f-stop. So this is an indication of the size of my aperture. So what you have here is the bigger the number, so mine will go all the way up to 32, the smaller the aperture. Okay, as we run this down, we can go to 4 in this case. Now remember, this is where you have to pay attention to the lens. So right now I'm set on my lens at f4, so it allows me to do this. Now if I go and zoom in the lens, I can still set the camera at f4, but the lens can only do f5.6, so I'm actually overexposing the camera compared to what the lens is capable of in this configuration. Okay, so what does this do and why do we care? Well, the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. The bigger the aperture, the narrower or shallower your depth of field. So what this means is when I set it on the low end of these numbers, so the 4 to about 7.1, even 8, not so much, but down in these ranges here, what I'm going to get out of this is a scenario where a subject will be in focus and the background will be increasingly blurry. So if I'm doing portrait photography, this is a great way to do it. Sometimes I choose to do this kind of setting if I'm going to be taking pictures of flowers or some other kind of wildlife in nature. Maybe I've got, maybe I'm taking pictures in a zoo and I want the animal in focus, but I want to try to blur out the fence that's between me and them. Then I can try to set up selective focus on the animal's eyes and then set a shallow depth of field or a small number on my f-stop to try to get a large aperture and narrow depth of field. So I tend to use this setting if I'm taking pictures of weddings or graduations or anything where I want to really focus in on individuals and let the background blur a little bit. Then I'll use numbers like this. Now the thing to keep in mind is you're going to need a particular shutter speed to match this. So let me take my lens cap off and I'll show you with the current lighting what it's going to do for me. So like this, if I wanted to take a picture of the background that you see in front of you at an f-stop of 4.0, then that means I'll need 1/80th of a second with an ISO of 3200 in order to get a good exposure out of the deal. So as you can see there, let me bring this back up for you. As you can see there, it's pretty good. Now obviously I've got some backlighting on here, so it looks blown out, but it's really not as bad as it seems. So having the camera in this mode means that I can pick my depth of field very closely and then allow the camera to do the rest, which can be very useful. Now what if I want even more control? And I'm going to switch this over to full manual mode. So full manual mode means that I now have control of everything. So if I move my top control wheel up here, I'm adjusting my shutter speed. You can see that. And if I move the other dial down here, the one where my thumb would be, then I'll get my aperture. So let's say I wanted to have a situation where I was going to be free-handing a shot and I know I'm taking a picture of a moving object, so I want a shutter speed somewhere in the, let's say 1/160th of a second. We'll pick that one. Then let's say I want the entire shot to be in focus. I want the foreground, I want the background, I want the subject, I want everything. So I'm going to set this around f-stop of 22. Now what that means is I've got a really small hole that the light's going through, and then I've also got a pretty quick shutter speed. So I'm not going to have a lot of light on this sensor. So if I point this, let's point it at the background there. There we go. So what we have here, that's going to require an ISO of 32,000 to get a good shot out of this. So let's give it a try and see what we get. Okay, let me take a different picture so we actually got something to look at here. There we go. Okay. So if we bring this up, again, I know the lighting's not great for this, but basically I'm taking a picture of my lightning sensor sitting against the background here. And you can see that by doing it that way, it is in focus. It's a bit on the dark side, but then I've got a dark background as well. So the ISO allows me to get a pretty good exposure even with settings that are pretty constraining as far as the amount of light on the camera. Now the other place where you can do something with this, let's say I wanted to take a fast shutter speed and I wanted the subject only to be in focus. So I'm going to back this down to about f5. So f5 is going to give me a situation where I should have a narrow or shallow depth of field, and then my 1/60th of a second will allow me to deal with mobility. So let's give this a try. Okay, so if we take a look at this, you can see this one's much brighter. So the reason this is much brighter is because I was operating right at the limits of what the camera could do before. So having that fast shutter speed and that really tight aperture means that the ISO was running right at its limit just to be able to take the picture in the first place. But you see here, this one's considerably better. So you can't tell the difference in depth of field because my subject is sitting right up against the background. But I can tell you with certainty that if that background was a little bit further away, it would be more blurred than it is right now. So again, ways to control your camera. We have, for Canons anyway, we have the TV mode down here, which allows you to set shutter speed. We have the AV mode here, which allows you to set aperture, so aperture priority. Then we have full manual mode here, which gives you the ability to control both the shutter speed and the aperture. Now, this particular Canon, this is an EOS 5 Mark IV. This one, if I want to change my ISO, like let's say I really want full control of this, I don't want to let the camera have any control at all, then I'm going to push this button right here, this one. So that then gives me ISO control. So now if I operate this upper one, you can see I'm setting my ISO. Okay, so what I would do is set the ISO where I think I want it to be, and then push this button again, and now it puts me back in my standard settings. So I've fixed the ISO at 1250. I have an aperture of an f-stop of 5.0, and I have a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. So let's take this picture. Okay. So you'll notice this one is a whole lot darker. So if we compare these two, you can see that this one is considerably darker compared to that picture right there. So by changing the ISO, it gives you full creative control of your pictures. So the nice part about that is if I want to make something a little more moody and dark, I have that ability. Now, post-editing works pretty well. I don't do a lot of it myself. However, I know a lot of people definitely do, but you can get pretty much anything you want out of one of these pictures within reason. If you overexpose a section of the shot, like for instance, if you end up with just white, complete white somewhere in your picture, you really can't recover that. So even in post-editing, you're going to find it difficult to put contrast back into something that's gone fully white. On the other hand, if you have a slightly dark shot like this one is, you can actually do quite a bit to bring those shadows out and make that a little more visible. So there are a lot of adjustments you can make in post-editing if you choose to do so. Thanks for coming along on this little adventure on how to set up a camera using manual mode and aperture and shutter speed priority modes, and what you can do with those. I'll definitely be taking more pictures and showing you the techniques that I use, as well as taking you on the road with me as soon as I get the chance, and we'll do some photography trips and just show you what it's like out in the field, how you set up, how you might be able to get a good shot out of it, and the kinds of things that cameras can do for you. I'll be having some more videos coming up soon about finishing off the other projects that I've got going, and hopefully, and not too far from now, I'll be able to take you all out and do some actual exploring. I've got a pretty big trip coming up soon, and we'll see what we can do about taking some video of that. So until then, enjoy, and if you like these kinds of videos where we do some more technical things, please let me know, and I'll see you over the next horizon.